We finished hearing remarks from the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, suggesting that it might be a little longer until they're confident that the economy is going to be ready for rate cuts, as this economy is still running pretty hot. In the UK, there are some signs that things are cooling. An unemployment rate that jumped to 4.2% in today's data. The IMF today downgraded its growth forecast for the year, suggesting the UK economy is running about 0.3% below its potential, which could suggest policy is too tight. How soon will the UK be ready for a rate cut?
Well, that's a decision for the independent Bank of England, just like here in the US. That decision is taken independently. And they have to look at lots of things. I mean, we've still got very strong wage growth data. It's been going up for 9 months in a row in real terms. But I think the big message from today is that the IMF are saying that inflation is going to be 1.2% lower. There are people who are now forecasting inflation will be lower in the UK than in the US or possibly even the Eurozone. And so, you know, that situation we were in 18 months ago with inflation at 11.1%, that is well and truly behind us. And if you're looking forward in terms of longer-term growth prospects, the IMF today are saying that the UK will grow faster than France, Germany or Italy over the next 6 years. So we think we have very strong growth prospects.
So you aren't concerned at all about what potentially could happen to parts of the UK economy, like the labor market, if policy were to stay too tight for too much longer, given what you are saying is a downward trajectory in inflation?
Well, obviously, in the short term, we look to the Bank of England to get that fine judgment right. But what finance ministers like me can do is much more about the longer-term competitiveness of the UK economy. And we note that the IMF today say there's a whole section about the impact of AI on the UK economy because they recognise that London is now the world's second largest epicenter for AI R&D after San Francisco. And there's a huge amount happening in our tech economy, which is third only to the US and China globally. And that is really where the big growth in the future is going to come in the UK, and that's where we think makes it a very exciting bet for investors.
Well, and your point is taken, Chancellor, that you oversee the fiscal side, not the monetary side. So on the fiscal side, you have suggested that an election could happen potentially as soon as October. Should we expect another potential fiscal event between now and then, or have we seen all we're going to see on that front before the votes are cast?
Well, it's certainly the case that, you know, the feel-good factor as interest rates start to come down, as people start to feel higher real disposable incomes, will be stronger in people's minds come the early autumn than it is now. People have been through a very bruising period. Obviously, decisions about election timing are for the Prime Minister, and were we to have an October election, as I've said before, it would be possible to have a fiscal event in September. But we would decide much nearer the time whether that was the right thing to do.
Well, of course, you've already delivered a lot fiscally in terms of tax cuts, including personal tax cuts. And yet, when you look at polls, obviously the Conservative Party is still running significantly behind Labour, I believe by roughly 20 points. What else may need to be done on that front to convince UK voters to keep the Conservatives in power? What would you consider doing?
Well, I'd be very cautious about looking at those polls because, first of all, as we can see from the challenges facing incumbent governments, not just in the UK, but in the US and Germany, France, the electorate have been through a really difficult period with an energy shock, with high inflation, with a pandemic. But when it comes to a general election, it's a choice about the future. It's not a referendum on how you feel right now. And that becomes a very different decision in people's minds. And we know in the UK that around a fifth of voters have not yet made up their mind who they're going to vote for. So we think there's all to play for. And what we're seeing now is much more positive data beginning to come through. Very good prospects for the UK going forward, as confirmed by the IMF today. And I think all that means that our strongest argument to the British people is going to be that having turned that corner, we don't want to take any risks going forward that would mean that we don't have that exciting economic growth.
Well, something else the IMF warned about in its report today was around something you just mentioned, the idea of potentially an energy shock, considering we are still seeing hot wars, not just on the continent of Europe, but of course in the Middle East. We are waiting to see what kind of retaliation we might see from the Israelis after the Iranian attack over the weekend. How concerned are you about the way in which this conflict may escalate and the ramifications it could have, not just for humanity, but for the economy?
Well, I think we all have to be very concerned. But I think we should also take comfort from the fact that the two biggest shocks that we've seen in the last few years, the invasion of Ukraine and the attack on Israel, have both been met by a very united response from Western allies, much more united than our opponents were expecting. And I think that what that demonstrates is that when the chips are down, we recognise the seriousness of the situation. We work together with our friends and allies, and the relationship between the UK and the US is right at the centre of that Western response to the challenges we face.
Given that there are these still ongoing conflicts, would you ever give consideration to raising defense spending, or is your focus really primarily on delivering tax cuts, and that has to factor in?
Well, I think it's possible to do both, because tax cuts can help grow the economy. That means you have more resources for really important challenges like security. And what I would say is that, you know, the UK recognises we're the biggest spender on defence in Europe. We recognise that going forward we're likely to have to spend more. But part of our job is also to persuade other NATO European countries that they need to spend their proper amount. We can't just depend on the United States to defend Europe. We need to play our part.
Well, we've heard certainly a great deal of that messaging in the U.S. as well, where there has been a evolving conversation as for funding for Ukraine. Certainly on Capitol Hill in Washington, it does seem that there will be a legislative effort now that could hit the floor this week that involves repo, the idea of taking seized Russian assets and using that to fund Ukraine's war effort. That's something the U.S. would like to pursue. Would you like to see the UK pursue that? Would you ask your colleagues that you were going to see at the IMF World Bank meetings down in Washington this week to congregate around that idea?
Well, I think it's a very intriguing proposal. I'll be meeting Secretary Yellen in the next couple of days, and I'll certainly be talking to her about it and getting some more detail on that. But I think we should be thinking about anything we possibly can to come to the support of Ukraine. This is an absolutely existential battle, not just for Ukraine itself, but for a global order in which, since the Second World War, we have largely stopped large countries thinking they can just invade their neighbours and get away with it. And if we were to let Russia get away with invading Ukraine, the ramifications would be huge, not just in Europe, but all over the world. So I think this is a proposal we should look at very carefully.
Well, and you'll speak with Secretary Yellen about that, but of course the U.S. can only do so much in this regard. A lot of these frozen assets are not held by the United States. They're held on the continent of Europe. What kind of conversations have you had with your European counterparts around this idea, and whether it could actually work as well in reality as it may seem like it could when just thinking about the idea?
Well, Kailey, that is the point, isn't it? Everyone has to do their bit. And the US has taken the lead in terms of the military support for Ukraine. The UK has taken the lead in Europe. But countries like France and Germany have also given tremendous economic support to Ukraine. Everyone has to do their bit. So on this particular issue, there is a particular role for EU countries, but we'll be having a very open discussion. One thing I can assure you is that the G7 countries, the leading democracies in the world, are absolutely united in our support for Ukraine.